The rain came down hard over the fields of Normandy, mud clung to every tread, and the air smelled of oil and gunpowder. A British Cromwell tank sleek, fast and proud, lurched through a narrow hedgerow lane. Its commander shouted orders over the radio, trying to keep pace with the advancing infantry. But halfway through the climb, a terrible grinding noise echoed inside the hull. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. Nearby, an American Sherman tank rumbled past steady, loud and almost casual. Its crew waved as they rolled by a column of 30 more following behind. The Cromwell's crew could only watch in silence. They had speed, they had style, but when it came to endurance, the Americans had built something entirely different. That day, as Cromwell's lay broken in ditches and Sherman's pushed through mud, a quiet truth became clear. Britain had built a racehorse for a short sprint. America had built a workhorse for a long war. This is the story of two philosophies of tank warfare and why one could cross 2,000 miles without breaking. Before the war began, Britain imagined its next great battle would look like the last one. Fast-moving columns sweeping across open plains, chasing down retreating enemies, like in the First World War's final months. So, in the late 1930s, British engineers split their tank doctrine into two distinct classes: infantry tanks, slow and heavily armoured, and cruiser tanks, fast and lightly protected. The Cromwell was born from that cruiser lineage, a machine meant to dash through gaps in enemy lines, exploit chaos, and outmaneuver slower foes. Its designers dreamed of a tank that could sprint across Europe with the power of a race car and the agility of a scout. The key to that dream lay under its armour, the Rolls-Royce Meteor engine, a detuned version of the legendary Merlin that powered the Spitfire. It was an engineering masterpiece, smooth, powerful, and distinctly British. But there was a problem. Cromwell wasn't being designed for a war that had already changed. The open deserts of North Africa, where speed mattered most, were giving way to the hedgerows of Normandy, muddy, narrow, and brutal on machines. British command, still thinking in terms of lightning raids and high speed dashes, didn't realise that the coming battles would demand something else entirely: endurance. When the Cromwell finally entered combat in 1944, it was fast, frighteningly so. On roads, it could reach speeds that made other Allied tanks look like tractors. Crews loved that feeling of flight. But once off-road, the dream began to crack. The Meteor engine overheated. The suspension failed under long marches. Components weren't standardized, meaning repairs required custom-made parts and long downtimes. It was a tank built for a sprint in a war that had become a marathon. And while Britain chased perfection, America was building something very different, something almost too simple to fail. Across the Atlantic, the Americans were watching Europe burn and 15, drawing very different conclusions about what a tank should be. To the US Army, reliability wasn't optional. It was the backbone of warfare. The nation's generals and engineers knew that no matter how powerful a tank was on paper, it meant nothing if it broke down before the battle. And so, when the United States began designing what would become the M4 Sherman, the goal wasn't to create the fastest or the most heavily armoured tank. The goal was to create one that would always work. From the start, the Sherman's design reflected America's industrial philosophy: standardization, mass production, and simplicity. Every part of the Sherman, from its track links to its engines, could be built by different factories, shipped across oceans and swapped in the field without modification. Unlike the Cromwell's finely tuned Meteor, the Sherman's engines were designed for rough use, built by Ford, Chrysler, Continental, and General Motors mechanics in dusty workshops or muddy foxholes could repair one, with basic tools and a spare afternoon. And it wasn't just talk. Reports from Tunisia, Italy, and later France described Shermans driving hundreds of miles between engagements with only minor maintenance. Crews joked that their tanks could go 2,000 miles without braking, and some really did. But this reliability wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. The US Ordnance Department tested prototypes until they failed, then built them again. Simpler, sturdier, and easier to fix. Was a philosophy of function over finesse. While British and German engineers prided themselves on complexity, the Americans took pride in consistency. A Sherman might not have looked as sleek as a Cromwell, or carried the same prestige as a Raisand Panther, but it had something the others didn't. The guarantee that when the commander shouted, "Move out!" it would. And when the Allies finally landed in Normandy, that difference would decide who rolled forward and who broke down in the mud. When the Cromwell first entered battle in Normandy in the summer of 1944, British crews were excited. On paper, it was everything they'd wanted: fast, low profile, and armed with a 75mm gun. In the open countryside, it could outrun anything the Germans had. But Normandy wasn't open country. It was hedgerow, hell-tight lanes, thick mud and ambushes at every turn. The Cromwell's speed was useless when it could barely turn without throwing a track. Its powerful Meteor engine gave it the lungs of a race car, but its suspension and cooling systems weren't built for long-distance slogging through rough terrain. After just a few hours of marching, the engines began to overheat. Fan belts snapped and clutches burned out. Tank crews soon learned the truth. The Cromwell could sprint brilliantly for 20 miles, but ask it to run for 200, and it would start to die. Accounts from British armoured units describe long nights repairing broken gearboxes under rain and mortar fire. Mechanics scavenged parts from knocked-out tanks just to keep one or two vehicles running. Meanwhile, American units with Shermans simply rolled on, stopping only to refuel and keep going. The Cromwell's armament also proved frustrating. Its 75mm gun, adapted from the American design, could fire effective high-explosive rounds against infantry, but struggled against late-war German armour. When faced with Panthers or Tigers, Cromwell crews often had to rely on manoeuvre and luck, a terrifying prospect in a machine that could break down mid-turn. Yet despite all that, British crews loved the Cromwell's spirit. It was fast, responsive and fun to drive, almost like a sports car. In a world of tractors, reconnaissance regiments used it effectively, darting ahead to scout enemy positions or screen flanks. But in the grand theatre of armoured warfare, where logistics, reliability and sustained movement won campaigns, Cromwell was a racer in the wrong race. It was beautiful, powerful and brave, but not built for the grind of total war. By the time the Allies stormed Normandy, the Sherman had already seen it all: blazing deserts, muddy Italian valleys, and the frozen hedgerows of winter Europe. It had been battered, burned, rebuilt, and still kept fighting. The Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was an ecosystem. Its design allowed for constant upgrades and field modifications without compromising reliability. Crews swapped engines in a single afternoon, changed transmissions in roadside workshops, and patched armour with salvaged steel. American engineers had designed the Sherman to move not just across the battlefield but across continents. Logistics officers loved it. Each Sherman shared parts with thousands of others, meaning a tank damaged in Italy could be repaired with components shipped from Detroit or Casablanca. In the desert campaigns of North Africa, British and American crews quickly noticed something Shermans just didn't quit. Sand clogged radiators, tracks bent under heat. But somehow, they kept going. German soldiers were shocked to see Allied tanks still operational after days of pursuit while their own vehicles waited for recovery trucks. Then came Italy, mountain roads, endless rain and crushing mud. Yet the Sherman marched on crews, often joked that if the tank had lungs, it would breathe through mud. Even when bridges collapsed or roads disappeared, the Shermans simply found another way around. When the invasion of France began in June of 1944, Sherman was no longer a newcomer, it was a veteran. Entire armoured divisions could roll hundreds of miles with minimal breakdowns. Supply trucks carried spare parts by the ton, and mechanics knew every inch of the machine. It was a tank that soldiers trusted. A famous British tanker once said, "The Sherman wasn't the best tank in the war, but it was the one that was always there." By the time Allied forces reached Germany, some Shermans had travelled thousands of miles from Tunis to Berlin on the same chassis. Engines had been swapped, of guns upgraded, but the heart of the tank remained the same. It wasn't perfection that made it legendary, it was endurance, the kind that turns a machine into a myth. When historians compare the Cromwell and the Sherman, They often focus on armour, thickness or gun power. But the real difference, the one that mattered in the field, was engineering philosophy. The Cromwell was a masterpiece of British craftsmanship. Each one was built almost like a bespoke automobile precision parts, finely tuned systems and components that weren't always interchangeable, that made it powerful on paper, but a nightmare for mechanics under fire. A broken gearbox on one Cromwell might not fit another. Bolts varied by factory engines, needed specific tools and fittings. Even small issues could take days to fix. Meanwhile, the Americans did the opposite. They treated the Sherman not as a luxury product, but as a mass-produced tool of war. Every tank off the assembly line shared the same bolts, same fittings, same layout. A part from a factory in Illinois could fit perfectly into a tank made in California, and that meant something profound in wartime. When a Sherman broke down, crews didn't panic, they just fixed it. Armoured units carried mobile workshops that could rebuild an engine overnight. Entire divisions kept spare powertrains stacked in crates, ready to drop into a tank at a moment's notice. The Cromwell, by contrast, demanded specialists. British crews often had to call in trained engineers, delaying operations and slowing offensives. Even suspension systems told the story. The Cromwell's Christie suspension offered excellent speed on roads, but was notoriously hard on parts. The Sherman's simpler vertical volute suspension might not have looked fancy, but it was durable, easy to service, and forgiving in rough terrain. The data told the same tale. American armoured divisions reported roughly one major mechanical failure per 100 miles of movement. British Cromwell units, nearly double that, sometimes more, in bad conditions. What Britain saw as elegance, America saw as fragility. What America built for function, Britain built for form. And as the war dragged on, that difference decided who could keep moving and who stayed behind in the mud behind. Every statistic, every blueprint, and every battle report were the men who lived inside those steel beasts. Their voices tell the real story of what it felt like to trust or not trust the machine that carried them through war. British tanker. Corporal Arthur Miles once wrote in his diary, "The Cromwell moves like a horse at full gallop, but she tires just as quickly. When she runs, you feel untouchable. When she stops, you feel naked." That sentence captured the love-hate relationship so many crews had with the tank. They adored its speed and handling. The Cromwell could dart through villages, whip around corners, and feel almost alive under the driver's hands. But when it broke, and it often did that same grace, turned to grief. Crews spent long nights in cold fields trying to repair engines that had seized or transmissions that refused to shift. And nothing stung more than watching columns of Shermans roll steadily past slower, heavier, but unstoppable. One British gunner recalled in a letter home, "You could hear the Americans coming for miles. A low growl, steady, confident. We envied them that sound." For American tankers, that confidence became part of their spirit. A Sherman crew knew their machine might not outgun a Tiger or outpace a Panther, but it would start every morning. That reliability became a strange kind of courage. Staff Sergeant William Rhodes of the 3rd Armoured Division once said, "Our Shermans were like dogs, loyal, noisy, and always ready to go. You take care of her. She takes care of you." Even when the Sherman burned, as it often did when hit crews never blamed the tank, they blamed the war. Because until the very end, the Sherman never let them down by choice. Cromwell crews, meanwhile, felt pride and pain in equal measure. They knew that the machine was beautifully made, but beauty was a burden in war. And every time another breakdown forced them to stop, they understood the cost of over-engineering. It wasn't just metal failing, it was morale. By the war's end in 1945, the lessons were burned deep into steel and memory alike. Britain had learned that elegance couldn't replace endurance, and America had learned that simplicity could win wars. The Cromwell's struggles weren't forgotten. British engineers went back to the drawing board and asked the hard questions. What good was speed without strength? What use was power if it couldn't last? Their answers came quickly. The Comet tank appeared in late 1944, an evolution of the Cromwell, built sturdier with better suspension, and a new gun that could finally face German armour head-on. It was what the Cromwell had always wanted, to be fast and dependable, and from the Comet came the legendary Centurion, the tank that would go on to define post-war British armour for decades. America, meanwhile, kept refining the Sherman new. Variants rolled off the lines, heavier guns, better armour, wet ammo storage to protect crews from fires. The Sherman Easy 8, with its improved suspension and cruise of high-velocity gun, became one of the best balanced tanks of the war's final year, and when peace finally came, those lessons shaped everything that followed. The US moved on to the Pershing, then to the Patton series, all inheriting the Sherman's philosophy of reliability first. Looking back, even German officers admitted it. Field reports captured after the war showed their grudging respect. The Sherman was inferior in power, one wrote, but it was everywhere. That was the secret. The Sherman didn't win by brilliance or beauty. It won by being there. And Britain, to its credit, never forgot that truth either. The tanks that came after Comet, Centurion, Chieftain all carried a little bit of the Sherman's soul. Endurance before elegance, dependability before perfection. In the end, both nations learned the same hard lesson, that the best tank isn't the one that looks good in parades, it's the one that brings its crew home. In the spring rain of 1945, convoys of Allied armour stretched from the beaches of Normandy all the way into the heart of Germany. Thousands of tanks, British, Canadian and American, rumbled through shattered cities and across broken bridges. Among them were Cromwells and Shermans side by side, symbols of two paths toward the same victory. One, the British racehorse, elegant, fast but fragile. The other, the American workhorse, plain, sturdy and relentless. The Cromwell had heart. It was built by men who believed war could still be fought with precision and pride. The Sherman had muscle, built by men who believed victory came through endurance and numbers. And as the war drew to a close, the proof lay scattered across Europe. Tanks rusting in fields, engines still warm, tracks still caked with mud. From miles of movement, many Shermans, scarred and battered, had survived the journey from North Africa to Germany, 2,000 miles of hell and history. In the end, it wasn't about who built the fastest or who had the thickest armour. It was about who kept moving. Because in war, just like in life, the race doesn't always go to the swift or the strong. Sometimes it goes to the one that simply refuses to stop. The Cromwell ran with grace. The Sherman marched with grit. And it was grit that carried the Allies to victory.